Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is the taking of an oath of a new member. I'd like to invite Cameron Buchanan to take the oath.
Would you please raise your right hand and repeat after me? I, Cameron Roy Marchand Buchanan,
I, Cameron Roy Marchand Buchanan,
do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance
do swear that I will be faithful and true allegiance
to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to law.
to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to the law.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next item of business is portfolio questions. In order to get as many people in as possible, I'd refer short and succinct questions and answers to match. Question number 1, Kenneth Gibson.
The Scottish Government what it anticipates the scale of Westminster cuts to the Scottish budget will be to 2017-18 if Scotland remains part of the UK.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the UK Government set out forecasts of further public spending in the UK Spending Round announcement of the 26th of June 2013. The precise implications for Scotland would depend on decisions a future UK Government would take about departmental budgets and the application of the Barnett formula. However, it is estimated that on top of the real terms cut of around 10% to Scotland's DEL budget that has already been made between 2010-11 and 2015-16, the budget could be subject to further real terms cut of between 6% and 8% in the years to 2017-18.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. He will be aware of the comments of the Centre of Public Policy for Regions, Professor Jo Armstrong, on 7th of August when she said, and I quote, that the £2.7 billion real terms projected cut in day-to-day spending still to come will be increasingly hard to accommodate, especially given the £1.8 billion already experienced since 2009-10. Cabinet Secretary, please indicate what the impact on jobs, growth and services would be to Scotland of such a draconian cut, and is this not another argument for Scotland to vote yes at next year's referendum?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has had to manage significant reductions in the public finances that have been applied since the spending review of 2010. And as a consequence of that, we have had to take a range of difficult decisions to ensure that our budgets have remained in balance and that we have delivered the type of financial responsibility that if only the UK Government had exercised it in the past, we might not be in the financial mess that the United Kingdom is currently in. So we have a strong record of managing the public finances, of affording the priorities that we believe are important to the people of Scotland, but that should not in any way disguise the degree of financial pressure and strain that we are managing. And in relation to Mr Gibson's final point, I do agree with him that if Scotland had control of all of the resources available to us, we could make a great deal more success of the Scottish economy, the Scottish public finances and the quality of life of people in this country.
Question number 2, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on issues associated with underemployment.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is taking steps to address underemployment in Scotland. Our long-term ambition is to ensure that learners are able to make more successful transitions from school into post-16 education or training and then into work. Through a reform of post-16 education, colleges are being asked to ensure that training opportunities align well with future labour markets.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his reply. As he will know, statistics from 2011-12 have shown that more women are underemployed than men. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide any details of what the Scottish Government is doing, not only to tackle underemployment among the population as a whole, but to ensure that the gender gap is not further widened, both in terms of pay and also education?
Cabinet Secretary.
As Claudia Beamish will be aware, the Government convened in the course of the last year a summit involving a number of key players in the economy, not least of which the Scottish Trade Union Congress, to address some of the fundamental issues about women's participation in the labour market. Some of these arguments have been discussed with the Equal Opportunities Committee as part of their general budget scrutiny, and also have been discussed with the Economy and Tourism Committee in assessing some of the material around their own inquiry, and relate to two fundamental points. One is the imbalance in the labour market in relation to gender participation, much of which is long-term and deep-seated differences in the participation of different genders in the labour market. And secondly, is about steps we can take through the education system, through some of the measures the Government is taking in relation to expansion of childcare provision, for example, to make it possible for more and more women to enter the labour market. These are some of the significant issues the Government is pursuing as part of its approach on improving employability within the Scottish economy, and we will continue to do so. As Claudia Beamish will be aware from her wider interests in Parliament around the National Performance Framework, the Government does attach significant attention to ensuring that the correct balance is achieved in relation to economic development within the Scottish economy, and we will continue to do so in the years to come.
Question number 3, Graham Day.
To ask the Scottish Government what impact it considers a reduction in VAT would have on the Scottish tourism industry.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish tourism industry remains very concerned about the high level of VAT levied on their businesses, especially given that 24 of the 28 EU member states charge lower VAT rates on hotel accommodation than the UK currently does. I understand that the industry-led Scottish Tourism Alliance fully supports the campaign for reduced tourism VAT led by the British Hospitality Association and other key tourism bodies, which is leading industry pressure on this matter. The Scottish Government has made detailed representation to the UK Government regarding the effect of VAT on our tourism industry on a number of occasions, and continues to press the UK Government on this question.
Graham Day.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer. I wonder if he would agree with me that if the UK Government requires evidence of the positive impact that a VAT cut can have on the tourism sector, that they need only look at Ireland, where a recently published report on the effect of the Irish Government of reducing VAT on tourism-related goods and services to 9% in 2011 reveals the move has led to the creation of circa 10,000 jobs and a €40 million boost to the Exchequer in 2012 alone from increased overseas visitor numbers. Ireland, of course, has achieved this because it has control of all the financial levers. Is what has happened there yet another example of the benefits Scotland could enjoy from independence?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the issue that Mr Day raises is a significant issue because there's been clearly marshalled evidence, as I cited in my original answer, by the Scottish Tourism Alliance and by other parties, on the effect that the differential effect of elements of the VAT regime in the United Kingdom can have on the tourist industry. It is, of course, an area that is beyond the responsibility of the Scottish Government and out with the powers of the Scottish Parliament. But clearly, if the Parliament was to have a wider range of financial powers under independence, then the Scottish Government would have the choice and the ability to address the issues and to ensure that tourism, which is of course a very successful and important industry in the growth of the Scottish economy, could make an even greater contribution to economic growth within Scotland.
Murdo Fraser.
The Cabinet Secretary is clearly very enthusiastic about cutting taxes where responsibility lies elsewhere. Can he confirm that the rumours are true that he will be in the budget next week announcing a major cut in business rates for businesses in the tourist sector? Or is it just the case that he'd rather grandstand on the constitutional issue than take responsibility for taxes that are within his own remit?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm very surprised by Mr Fraser's question, because Mr Fraser should be aware that the Scottish Government presides over the most competitive business tax rates regime, the business rates regime in the United Kingdom. So if we're already the most competitive business rates regime, then I think that's a position that Mr Fraser should be welcoming. But of course, Mr Fraser is unlikely to welcome that, because Mr Fraser voted against these provisions because he voted against my last budget. And I find it, Presiding Officer, I am simply reminding Parliament that Mr Fraser and his Conservative colleagues pressed their buttons to vote against the Government's budget, which voted against the most competitive business tax regime in the United Kingdom. Now, Mr Brown is sitting next to him. Mr Brown, I'm sure, could remind Mr Fraser he was the author of the Conservatives' budget strategy last year, and if Mr Fraser needs some reminding of what he voted for, then I'm sure Mr Brown will be only too happy to fill in the details and to reinforce what I've just said to Parliament.
Question number 4, Sarah Boyack.
To ask the Scottish Government how much its pledge to maintain the so-called triple lock for pensions will cost.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has made a commitment to uprate state pensions by the triple lock in an independent Scotland. The triple lock protects the value of pensions over time, ensuring that they keep pace with average earnings and inflation, with a minimum increase of 2.5% each year. The triple lock is current UK policy for the basic state pension up to 2015, but the UK Government has not committed to continue the triple lock beyond that, not for current pensioners and not for future pensioners who retire under the new single-tier pension. Social protection, which includes pensions, is consistently more affordable in Scotland than in the UK, both as a proportion of GDP and of tax revenues. A paper on pensions for an independent Scotland will be published in due course and will address these issues in detail.
Sarah Boyack.
Given that the Scottish Government does not envisage personal tax rises should Scotland become independent, will the state pension age increase to help pay for the policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as Sarah Boyack well knows, the current proposals, if we remain part of the United Kingdom, will involve the increase in the state pension age. And I haven't seen anything from Sarah Boyack's side of the argument which suggests that the Labour Party is in any way in a different position from increasing the state pension age from the current proposals of the United Kingdom Government. And indeed, I haven't heard from Sarah Boyack about any aspect of the Labour Party's commitment on the triple lock, because as I understand it, they are in exactly the same position as the current United Kingdom Government. And as I said to Sarah Boyack in my original answer, the Government will set out in detail the commitments that it intends to make on pensions in a forthcoming paper, and I look forward to discussing those issues with Parliament in due course.
Gavin Brown, then I'm going to call Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Sarah Boyack didn't ask what the triple lock was. She asked how much it would cost. Given that this policy was published by Mr Sweeney on the 18th of June this year, several months ago, can he please tell the Chamber what the cost of that policy would be? Surely to goodness they costed it before they announced it.
Cabinet Secretary.
As we have made clear to Parliament already, and as I've just made clear to Sarah Boyack, the proportion of the GDP of Scotland and the proportion of tax revenues in Scotland that are allocated to deal with social protection is a lower proportion of our GDP or our tax revenues than the United Kingdom. So what the Scottish Government will do is set out in our pension paper the detail of how we will take this issue forward in recognition of the fact that pensioners need security and reliability over their income, which they don't have from the United Kingdom.
Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would agree with me that with Scotland having a higher tax raising over the last 30 years, and with 9.9% of the tax raising in the UK and only 9.3% of the tax spend, with an 8.4 population, that surely we're in a position to afford our pensions more than the UK.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the point that Mr Robertson makes is absolutely correct. Scotland contributes more to the United Kingdom than we receive back in return. 9.9% of UK taxes were contributed from Scotland. 9.3% of spending was accounted for in Scotland. And as I've indicated in my earlier answers to both Sarah Boyack and to Gavin Brown, Scotland, the proportion of our GDP and our tax revenues that are required to support social protection is a lower proportion than the rest of the United Kingdom, which demonstrates the affordability of pension provision in Scotland and the commitments that the Government is making.
Question number 5, Drew Smith.
To ask the Scottish Government in what year it anticipates an oil fund could be set up in an independent Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Fiscal Commission Working Group are developing a fiscal framework to ensure that from the outset, an independent Scotland will have a mechanism in place to manage year-on-year changes in oil and gas revenues and to ensure that, when appropriate, a proportion of these receipts are invested for the long-term benefit of the people of Scotland. The Fiscal Commission Working Group will publish a report on the operation of an oil stabilisation and savings fund in the coming weeks.
Drew Smith.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, although it hasn't provided us a better answer than the Deputy First Minister managed on Radio Scotland yesterday. So does the Cabinet Secretary at least accept that tax revenues from the North Sea cannot be spent twice in an independent Scotland any more than they can be in any other country? And given the conflicting views which have been expressed by Scottish ministers on this so far, will he tell us now whether he would plan to take money from public services to pay money into an oil fund while Scotland remains in deficit?
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government's position on the issue of an oil fund has been absolutely consistent, that we can only contribute to an oil fund when the circumstances and the opportunities enable us to do so. Now, the illustration I would give to Mr Smith is about the last year for which information is available, which showed that Scotland in 2011-12 had a relative financial surplus of £4.4 billion. Translated into other language, which for Mr Smith, it means that Scotland was in a stronger position in terms of our public finances than the rest of the United Kingdom. That opens up the choices for Scotland either to spend more of that differential advantage, or to invest more in an oil fund, or to reduce the level to which we are undertaking borrowing. But these opportunities only arise if we are able to exercise the control and the responsibility that would enable Scotland to take these decisions. And of course, we can't do that under the current constitutional settlement, and if Mr Smith has his way, we won't be able to do it in the foreseeable future. And all I can say to Mr Smith is that I think Scotland has experienced such wasted opportunity because of the way in which our oil revenues have been mismanaged since the 1970s by UK governments, that this is the opportunity for Scotland to take control of these issues and ensure that we have the ability to invest the wealth of Scotland in creating the most secure future for the people of Scotland, and that only arises out of independence.
Stuart Stevenson.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that Alistair Darling was being honest when interviewed on BBC Hard Talk on the 19th of August, when he conceded that UK governments have wasted oil revenues by not investing in an oil fund? And will he note that in that interview he admitted that there was no question but that Scotland can be successfully independent?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the comments by Alistair Darling are an interesting departure from all that he presided over when he was a minister in the United Kingdom. I think his admission now that Scotland has the ability, the capability and the resources to be independent is a welcome concession at such a late date. And the fact that he's been part of the regime that has so wasted the oil resources of Scotland, I think it's a welcome admission that he now sees the advantages of an oil fund. Of course, he's not alone. There are many other commentators that have recognised exactly the same point that Mr Darling has now made, but it's welcome when we have some conversions in the arguments that are put forward by our political opponents.
Question 6, Siobhan McMahon.
To ask the Scottish Government what assistance it's providing staff at the Phillips Lighting plant in Hamilton following the company's announcement that it will phase out the production of luminaires at the plant.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Ministers were concerned to learn of the situation at Phillips Lighting, which will be of major concern to the individuals affected, their families and the surrounding area. Mr Ewing spoke with the Hamilton Operations Manager to offer Scottish Government support. We have agreed that officials from Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Development International will meet with the company to discuss the situation. Support has been offered through our Partnership Action for Continuing Employment initiative for any employees who may be facing redundancy. PACE support will be tailored to meet the needs of the individuals involved in the event that redundancies go ahead. I hope this provides reassurance that we will do everything we possibly can do to maximise the effectiveness of these interventions, to minimise the impact of the job losses on the individuals affected, and to ensure that the company and the surrounding area are able to continue to rely on employment in this factory.
Siobhan McMahon.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and as you said, the recent announcement has come as a massive blow to the loyal and long-standing workforce in Hamilton. It was disappointing to learn that those jobs have been outsourced to other countries such as France and Poland. It would appear that the loyal workforce at Hamilton plant has been totally disregarded in this decision taken by Phillips. I'm also extremely concerned at the implications of these redundancies for the remaining workforce at the Hamilton plant. What assurances can the Scottish Government provide to the remaining workforce that it will do everything it can to guarantee their long-term future at the plant?
Cabinet Secretary.
I unreservedly accept the concern that has been raised by Siobhan McMahon on this question, and clearly when there is such a substantive possible loss from the workforce of more than half the workforce, it is a matter of real concern. I can assure the member that in many of these circumstances where there is employment loss, the assistance that is able to be provided by Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Development International can, in many circumstances, lead to an improvement in the performance and operation of companies, and that over time employment can be restored and it can grow again in individual factories. We've had a number of examples of that, and I can assure Siobhan McMahon that that will be the approach that is taken by Scottish Enterprise to provide what support we can in the short term to try to avoid the redundancies in the first place, but secondly in the long term to make sure that whatever are the consequences of the employment loss at Phillips Lighting, we are able to support the company to grow again and to develop, and that will be at the heart of the government's interventions.
Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I just bring my thanks from the workers that I've spoken to in the Hamilton plant in my constituency for the immediate action that the Scottish Government took within hours of the announcement last week. And can the Minister give us maybe an update on what the work of what Scottish Development International are thinking about? Because there's 7,000 workers across the whole company globally that have been affected by this, and it seems that the Hamilton numbers are disproportionate to the rest of the global market.
Cabinet Secretary.
There are a number of practical steps that Scottish Development International will be involved in, and also Scottish Enterprise will be involved in. Scottish Enterprise will be meeting members of a working party tomorrow that includes the local management, workforce representatives and a representative from the Trade Union Unite to discuss this situation. We will also be having discussions through Scottish Development International with the Dutch management of Phillips in order to try to ascertain what other steps can be taken at that level. So those are some of the interventions that we will take in relation to the business development functions of the company. I would also say, as I said to Siobhan McMahon a second ago, that the local PACE team will be ready to offer particular support to assist individuals, and I think as members will appreciate, the PACE team has developed a significant expertise in trying to ensure that individuals are able to find alternative employment should they face redundancy, and that will be the case in this circumstance.
Question 7, Mike McKenzie.
To ask the Scottish Government what opportunities it considers independence would bring for increased consumer protection.
Cabinet Secretary.
In our publication, Consumer Protection and Representation in an Independent Scotland, published on the 13th of August, we outlined our vision for consumer protection and representation in an independent Scotland. The paper suggests creating a less complex system of consumer protection that better reflects Scotland's needs and puts consumers, small businesses and local communities at the heart of its work.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. You'll be aware that unfair and disproportionate delivery charges are a particular concern in many parts of the Highlands and Islands. Does he agree with me that this is an issue that we could tackle if we had the appropriate powers to do so?
Mr Mackenzie raises a practical issue which is of significance and importance to people principally in the Highlands and Islands, but the issue will affect other rural and more isolated areas. Clearly, the responsibility for exercising powers in this area rests with the United Kingdom Government, and obviously an opportunity would arise for Scotland to take steps to ensure that no areas of Scotland were put at a disadvantage as a consequence of delivery charges. That essentially is a very good example of putting the consumer at the heart of the arrangements that we would put in place to ensure that we could best meet their needs and expectations and to create some further competitive advantage for the Scottish economy.
Question number 8, Fiona MacLeod.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the latest employment figures.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the latest labour market data covering the period April to June 2013 showed that unemployment in Scotland increased by 13,000 over the quarter. Showed that employment in Scotland increased by 13,000 over the quarter. This was the 7th consecutive monthly release showing a rise in the employment rate. At 72.1%, the employment rate in Scotland continues to be higher than the UK rate. These figures, coupled with other recent positive developments in the Scottish economy, show an improving picture. However, much more still needs to be done and key challenges remain. That is why the priority of the Government continues to focus upon securing the recovery and delivering faster, sustainable economic growth.
Fiona MacLeod.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and I'm sure many members across the Chamber, or all members across the Chamber, will welcome these good employment figures. But as the Cabinet Secretary said at the end, and I'm sure he'll agree with me, that we could do even better if we had the full economic powers that only independence can bring us.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Government is exercising its responsibilities to the full in taking forward the work to support economic recovery. It has been implicit in the steps that we've taken forward in our budget interventions since the downturn in 2008. It will remain uppermost in my thinking around the publication of the Government's budget next week. So we will do all that we can within our existing responsibilities. But clearly, there are a number of areas, and I've highlighted to Parliament before, the frustration that the Government has experienced about the very substantial reductions in capital expenditure that we have experienced in Scotland. And that is an illustration of one of the areas of responsibility that is currently exercised by the United Kingdom Government, which we believe we could exercise more in the interests of Scotland if we had those responsibilities here in the Scottish Parliament.
Question number 9, Michael McMahon.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it considers that pyrolysis energy from waste plants has a role to play in achieving its zero waste target, and what its position is on the comment of Pete Wishart MP that they should not be given planning permission as they are a pollutant-belching monstrosity.
Minister Derek Mackay.
Minimising the need for treating residual waste is at the heart of our zero waste plan. That is why we introduced regulations last year to transform recycling services in Scotland, and why we have set a 70% recycling target for Scotland. Recovering value, including energy from materials that can't currently be recycled, is preferable to sending them to landfill where they create harmful greenhouse gases. This is in line with the waste hierarchy which underpins the zero waste strategy. Applications for waste treatment facilities are determined solely on their individual planning merits.
Michael McMahon.
For his response, but is the Minister aware that confusion has been caused to both industry and local communities by the refusal of Scottish ministers to support a planning appeal to site an energy from waste plant in Perth? In my initial question, I quoted local SNP MP, but is he also aware that John Swinney also backed those who opposed the incinerator, while Rosanna Cunningham expressed her health fears over pollutant fumes? In the letter that he refers to from Richard Lockhead to the campaigners, he says that treating waste in thermal treatment plants where the heat can be captured and the electricity generated is undoubtedly more preferable than sending to landfill. So can the Minister tell us what it is? Are incinerators pollutant belching monstrosities which pose a risk to health? Is it only in Perth that there are legitimate health concerns, while at Dovedale, Carnbrough and Hamilton and Lanarkshire they are safe? Are pyrolysis plants vital components in the zero waste strategy, or are they not? And are they safe or are they not?
Cabinet Secretary, Minister.
Well, I think that Mr McMahon listed a number of formidable representatives for their communities in terms of the views that they represent. I think Scottish Government policy is clear, but we have to be very careful when considering planning matters. And in planning matters, each case is taken on its merits, with all material considerations taken into account. In terms of the planning system, it has that independence where the local determining authority will consider it in the first instance. In terms of regulations, there's a role for SEPA. And the advice we would give is energy from waste does have a role to play within our zero waste policy, albeit a limited one. And for those reasons, I think it's important that we continue to ensure that the planning system stays above party politics, which is where I think Mr McMahon would rather take us.
Liam Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the Scottish Minister's decision to refuse this pyrolysis plant in Perth, can the Minister then explain why a Perthshire businessman has been given the go-ahead by Scottish Government to build one of these monstrosities in my constituency at Carnbrough and Coatbridge, and could the merit of this particular plant now be reconsidered?
Minister.
I'm very aware of the member's concerns about the application in her own constituency, and I'm conscious of an outstanding commitment to meet with the representatives of that campaign. The member will recall that it was inappropriate to meet them whilst the issue was live and then potentially challengeable by judicial review. Now that these considerations have taken their full course, I can meet with the representatives and cover the issues that she has raised in her question. But I repeat again, the planning system will consider each case on the merits of the case in line with government policy.
Question number 10, Paul Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the impact is on employment of the reported increase in the use of zero hours contracts.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, employment policy is currently reserved to Westminster. However, the Scottish Government is actively considering whether issues around the use of zero-hour contracts can form a legitimate consideration for a public body as part of the public procurement process. The Scottish Government and its agencies do not directly employ people on zero-hours contracts.
Paul Martin.
Presiding Officer, I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would consider writing to every non-departmental public body in Scotland and request that they take steps to ensure that they do not employ anyone directly on a zero-hours contract.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm certainly happy to consider the suggestion that Mr Martin has made. If there are particular issues or concerns that he has about the issue of zero-hours contracts in this respect, I'm very happy to consider those if he draws them to my attention and to consider the suggestion that he's made today.
Question 11, Linda Fabiani.
To ask the Scottish Government what assistance it gives to small businesses.
Minister.
The Scottish Government recognises the valuable contribution small businesses make to our economy and is committed to maintaining a supportive environment to assist them to grow and thrive. For example, on 12th of June, we announced an £88 million investment in helping Scotland's young people into work and supporting small business growth. The investment package includes a £37.85 million SME growth programme to assist small businesses to grow and create an expected 3,000 jobs across Scotland. Earlier today, I outlined a range of reforms to the rate system to better support businesses, including the 89,000 recipients of the Small Business Bonus Scheme, who will be delighted, I am sure, that the scheme will continue.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you. The Minister's announcement was indeed welcome. In my own constituency, Minister, and indeed throughout South Lanarkshire, small and medium enterprises have benefited from young people being placed with them through the Youth Jobs Fund wage subsidy programme, and it's currently producing sustainment rates of 96% of young people still in work after 1 year. It's a real credit to South Lanarkshire Council and its partners. Would the Minister consider extending this success and using funding from the Youth Employment Scotland initiative to support this programme in delivering what could be a short, uncomplicated, subsidised wage programme, such as Youth Jobs Fund, for small employers right across the country?
Cabinet Secretary. Minister, promoted you again.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yes, I am very keen to hear more of the specific scheme in South Lanarkshire, and Linda Fabiani is absolutely correct on the success that this scheme and many others are having. We have ongoing dialogue with local authorities to ensure that the various strands of our youth employment strategy are supported and can develop and are based on good evidence, and where success is being delivered, then hopefully that can be repeated across the country. It's this in a range of packages, I think, that is giving young people hope in these very difficult times, led by the excellent work of the Youth Employment Minister, Angela Constance.
John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that it's some time since he raised the threshold for the Small Business Bonus Scheme, as many businesses in my constituency and across Scotland are just above the current threshold, and raising the support threshold would stimulate these small businesses. Can the Cabinet Secretary, or indeed the Minister, tell us if he has any plans to raise this threshold in the near future?
I can see it's catching with the POs. Minister.
Well, I'm glad the First Minister is also in the chamber to hear the recommendations of the rest of the chamber. But in terms of the question, in the consultation on business rates, the outcome, the government's response is published today. Of course, the thresholds for rates, exemptions and so on would be a matter for the budget process. But in specific relation to SBBS, we know it's been particularly successful, as I say, an increasing number of recipients of it. But the member, I'm sure, will be delighted to hear that we are bound to consult on a proposal that will give further powers to local authorities to create local relief schemes which can further support economic recovery and regeneration in communities across Scotland, and not least in our town centres. And I think that that will be welcomed by small businesses, in addition to the most generous rates relief package that this government has delivered.
Question number 12, Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to help people into employment.
The real Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, at 72.1%, the employment rate in Scotland is higher than the rest of the United Kingdom, while at 19.1%, youth unemployment remains lower than the rest of the UK. The Scottish Government is determined to reduce unemployment further, and through commitments like Youth Employment Scotland Fund, the Community Jobs Scotland Fund, we are tackling unemployment while supporting growth in Scotland's third sector and amongst the small and medium-sized enterprises.
Christina McKelvey.
Can I thank the real Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and take him back to the situation of Phillips and the challenges that the team at Phillips are facing right now, because imposed on us by Westminster is now a 45-day consultation period. And certainly the workers that I have spoken to have suggested that's my next month's mortgage payment, and they're really worried about only having 45 days to go through the process and the dangers that that poses for the workforce.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the issue that Christina McKelvey raises is a valid issue about the process. I think what the Scottish Government has to do is to operate within the framework that is established by law. What that means is that we have to take steps as early and as promptly as we possibly can do to find a different way of proceeding for the companies concerned, to ensure that any actions that can be taken to improve the prospects and the opportunities to either avoid loss of employment, or alternatively to encourage, should there be unemployment, a growth in activity within companies, that we can get on with that work as quickly and as effectively as possible. So I give Christina McKelvey the absolute assurance that the Government is focused entirely on how we can best do that, to ensure that we first of all protect employment, but if there is a loss of employment, that we act as speedily and effectively as we can do to try to recover opportunities for members of staff involved.
Question number 13, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how planning and regeneration can help achieve sustainable economic growth.
Minister.
Planning and regeneration can help achieve sustainable economic growth by proactively supporting development, contributing to that growth, and also to high-quality sustainable places. The planning system enables development of growth-enhancing activities by providing a supportive business environment whilst protecting and enhancing the quality of the natural and the built environment. The current review of Scottish planning policy will strengthen these principles.
Claire Adamson.
Can I thank the Minister for his answer? Can he set out the timescales in which the NPF3 and the new Scottish planning policy will come into effect?
Minister.
The original timescale was that NPF3, because of the statutory requirements, would be concluded and adopted in June 2014. Scottish planning policy, because it didn't require that statutory process, could have been adopted by the very end of this year or start of next year. I am convinced, though, of the benefits of carrying out the consultation in tandem and to give Parliament the opportunity to discuss both Scottish planning policy and national planning framework 3. I propose a new timescale for Scottish planning policy to be considered, giving Parliament its say, and both documents will be approved and adopted in the summer in June of 2014.
Question number 14, Neil Bibby.
To ask the Scottish Government how much it anticipates the differences between the wholesale value of taxation generated from remaining North Sea oil and gas resources.
Cabinet Secretary.
Up to 24 billion barrels of oil equivalent could still be recovered from the North Sea, with a potential wholesale value of up to £1.5 trillion. The value of future North Sea tax receipts will depend on a range of factors, including prices, production levels, investment and, importantly, a stable tax regime. However, it is clear that future tax receipts from the sector will be substantial and represent a significant resource for the people of Scotland. Over the 6 years to 2017-18, Scottish Government analysis suggests that North Sea production could generate between £41 and £57 billion in tax revenue.
Neil Bibby.
I thank the Minister for that answer. It's clear to everyone there's a very big difference between the two. Can I ask, therefore, why the First Minister deliberately attempted to conflate wholesale and tax revenue by claiming that the remaining value of North Sea oil and gas was worth £300,000 for every man, every woman and every child in Scotland? He's sat next to you, perhaps you could ask him.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr Bibby has plenty of opportunities to ask the First Minister questions if he happens to choose to. Maybe I could give him a tutorial about how to put in a question, although he seems to have managed it here to submit a question. So, perhaps he needs to, maybe they all need a wee tutorial to try and help them to work out how to submit questions to the First Minister. So, I think the position is absolutely crystal clear. There's a wholesale value for North Sea oil and gas, and there is a tax receipt that comes to the United Kingdom government as a consequence of the tax regime that's put in place. The big question is, why on earth is Scotland not getting access to the proceeds of the North Sea oil and gas tax regime, which Mr Bibby seems to be quite happy to leave to be squandered, just like the previous 40 years was squandered, with the same bunch in Westminster who've made such a mess of the public finances. Now, forgive me for deciding that I think in Scotland we would make a much better job of determining the future of our country, determining how we could use our resources, because we've made a success of the control of these issues in Scotland on other areas of policy, and we can do it on oil, gas, the public finances and the macroeconomic situation much better than Westminster will ever manage to do.
Question 15, Jackie Bailey.
The Scottish Government how an independent Scotland would deal with the impact of European pension regulations.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government intends that detailed negotiations to secure the transition to Scotland's independent EU membership will begin immediately after the referendum. This will include negotiations to determine the specific terms and, where necessary, any transitional arrangements under which an independent Scotland will take its place as a full EU member state.
Jackie Bailey.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for a long response that didn't shed much light on the issue? The Cabinet Secretary will of course be aware that the comments made by Alex Salmond in the Scottish Parliament on 2nd of May 2013 that we are not seeking an opt-out from the EU regulations are entirely incompatible with his comments to the Sunday Post on the 4th of August 2013. And these were that the way to deal with this is to get a derogation. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, in light of that, which is it? And is this indicative of the mess the Nationalists have got themselves into on such an important issue in just the space of 3 months, or perhaps the First Minister was confused.
Cabinet Secretary.
What the First Minister said to Parliament on the 2nd of May was he referenced the report from ICAS, which set out 3 approaches which could be taken to resolving this issue, which related to an exemption from existing schemes, a longer grace period, and the opportunity to construct schemes in Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. And that is what the First Minister said to Parliament on the 2nd of May. And that is, and the other point the First Minister made was that it is essential that we have dialogue and discussion with the relevant authorities, and that includes the United Kingdom Government, as to how we proceed on this particular question. But on the subject of a mess, let me just talk about the situation in relation to pensions in the United Kingdom. All of the issues that we wrestle with on pension funds in this country are a direct product of the decisions taken by Gordon Brown to raid pension funds. That is where the mess has come from. Those are the series of problems that we have got to try to resolve, because Gordon Brown was intent on raiding pension funds, and the Conservative Party, who were at the time when I was in the House of Commons in 1997, outraged at the steps that Gordon Brown took to raid pension funds, should be a great deal more concerned about it than they are with our Better Together friends in this parliamentary debate.
That ends the portfolio questions. The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on the helicopter